Er zijn 3 dingen in het leven van een kunstenaar. Ten eerste, te kunnen werken. Ten tweede, goed te kunnen werken. En ten derde, de grootst mogelijke weerklank bij zijn publiek te vinden.
Who's afraid of art? Tyrants and wannabe tyrants, so it seems.
Artist Alexandra Skotchelenko has been sentenced to 7 years in prison by St. Petersburg's invasion, spreading false information, disinformation.
With autocracy growing, with tyrants on the roll, Balie brings together over 40 international artists, writers and thinkers during Forum on European Culture. We celebrate the subversive power of art and literature and curate works of opposition that preserve the histories autocrats want to erase and imagine the futures they fear.
So my question is, Mr. President, what are you so afraid of?
Art against the tyrants. Not for the faint-hearted.
Welcome at the Balie. Welcome at the Forum on European Culture. Yeah, I'm really excited for this talk today. We're going to dive in themes such as class, migration, intergenerational shifts and gaps. And we're going to do so with 2 wonderful writers, namely Tash Aw and Radna Fabias. My name is Rogaya Sek, and I'm program editor here at the Balie. Yeah, and I want to start by welcoming Tash Aw to the stage. So a warm welcome to Tash Aw. Yes. So better introduction to you. He grew up in Malaysia, left for the UK in his teens to study law, lives in Paris but is currently staying in Berlin for a residency. He is the author of 6 books, including The Harmony Silk Factory and 5 Star Billionaire, which were longlisted for the Man Booker Prize. Welcome, Tash.
Thank you.
How are you doing?
Fine, I'm fine. I'm slightly jet lagged, but I just came back from Asia, but I'm good.
Also for a book tour?
Also for the book, yeah. Absolutely. Very happy to be back in Amsterdam.
Back in Amsterdam.
Yeah, I come. Amsterdam is a city I love. I come regularly, not as often as I would like to, but it always seems to be somewhere that, especially in a space like this, engage with trying to find out more about essential things about art and culture.
You're a real cosmopolitan, so to say.
I mean, I don't. Nowadays cosmopolitanism has such a sort of such a double meaning. It's taken to be slightly suspicious. But yeah,
artists are also suspicious.
Artists are always suspicious. But I guess, yeah, I mean, I don't deny it. I've always wanted to, growing up in Malaysia, I've always wanted to, I grew up in a very confined social milieu, very restrictive, and I always wanted to escape and to see more, not just in my own country, but further afield. So I guess I retain that feeling of wanting to engage with people and wanting to see how, actually to see how other people see me. Because in a sense, the more I'm always surprised by people's reactions to me and to where I'm from. And I think in seeing different people, I see more clearly who I think I am.
What did you find out about yourself?
That it's an ongoing process. It's a work in progress. That internally, and I'm sure we'll talk about this a lot in this session, everyone has an internal logic. Everyone has an internal view of themselves, as you do, and we've talked about this. And your own identity seems very easy to yourself. It seems very obvious. But when other people meet you, they just cannot seem to understand what you are. I live mainly in France at the moment for the last few years, since Brexit. I used to live in London before that. And, trying to explain to a French person and probably other European people as well, that I'm both Chinese and Malaysian. It's a complete headfuck for them. They can't get this. They can't understand that by nationality I'm Malaysian, but ethnically I'm Chinese, from a long line of Chinese immigrants in Malaysia. And so this very simple dual identity, which for me is the simplest, easiest thing I've ever experienced, because I've grown up with it, to other people seems incredibly complicated. And
it's not something uncommon in France.
Well, French people pretend it is, because I think in France there's the idea of universalism, there's the idea of just being French, and we don't notice your color, but it's true. People say that, I don't see color, I just see human beings, which I guess is a very admirable quality, but it's also completely, it's completely unreal. And so, things like that encourage me to look at my own identity as something perhaps richer and more complex than I assume it to be. And another thing that always strikes me is that Dutch people, very multilingual, the way Malaysians are. If you're Malaysian, you will grow up speaking at least 2 languages, and probably more, just because of the racial mix in Malaysia, and how just basically to go out into life you need 2 or 3 languages. And I find that if you come from certain kinds of backgrounds, namely, if you're a migrant or any kind of immigrant moving from one country to another, the ability to speak languages is seen as, it's a necessity. You leave one country and you go to another one to try and find a job, for example. You have to learn the language of that country. And so languages are a function for immigrants, a function of survival and a function of necessity. Whereas in Europe, in Western Europe, particularly amongst the middle classes, the ability to speak languages is seen as, it's the preserve of the bourgeoisie. So people who can speak several languages in France, if you can speak French, English, and German, it basically means you come from a very rich family. And so when people interview me, I read reports of I read articles about me, which describe me as being intensely cosmopolitan, because I can speak 3 languages. But those are the languages of my childhood. They're languages of survival. They're languages of basic communication. It's not like I went to some fancy school where, I was drilled in Russian or German at a very young age. So these kind of things, these differences in perceptions, I find, very interesting. Netherlands is a country I would like to know more about, but for whatever reason I haven't.
Maybe you will find out tonight. I want to dive in a little bit in Malaysia and of Southeast Asia. Because colonialism is like a major theme in your work. And for those of us less familiar with that history, can you explain a little bit about the colonial history or background of Malaysia and how it influenced your childhood growing up?
Malaysia is a country which has been colonized forever. It was colonized firstly by Arab sea traders who brought Islam to Malaysia in the 13th centuries, 13th and 14th centuries, and then by the Portuguese, and then by the Dutch. Forgotten now, but the Netherlands was occupied Malaysia, colonized Malaysia for the longest time. It's now thought.
We're also going to learn something about ourselves.
Yes, I mean it's now thought of Malaysia. People often identify as a British colony, former British colony, because that was the most recent one from the 1820s onwards officially. But in fact, people forget that the Netherlands occupied Malaysia for longer than that. So there are many layers of colonialism in Malaysia, and of course, the fact that English is still quite widely spoken as a second or third language is a vestige of those times. But you know, I grew up in primarily in the 80s, which is a time of intense nationalism, and Malaysia, like a lot of Southeast Asia, was growing economically very quickly during those years. And so I really grew up in a sort of a very post-colonial. It was almost a vacuum. We weren't really taught anything about colonial history, and in a sense, you know, it's because a lot of Southeast Asia has become hyper modern. We don't feel attached to colonial history, which means that our appreciation of history is slightly disjointed, because it's almost as if we haven't acknowledged, or we don't want to acknowledge, the colonial past, because the colonial past involves shame. It involves having the national narrative belong to someone else, and that's why it's not written about. So I guess a lot of my work is about both incorporating that reality, the reality of the past, which is silent in a lot of our lives, but which is nonetheless there, without it being present in everyday life, if that makes sense.
Was there a specific moment that it appeared to you?
Yeah, it appears whenever people talk about the war, because the war is made to seem as though it was something that appeared suddenly, but in fact it wasn't spontaneous. It was the result in Malaysia. The effects of the war were the culmination of many, many decades before that of imperial history colliding within itself, all these forces contrasting within a short period of time. And I think in some ways, you know, Malaysia is a multi-ethnic country composed of ethnic Malays, ethnic Chinese, ethnic Indians, and a lot of other people, including native Malaysians. And it's a very uneasy mix. It's, you know, race relations are very, very tense. And a lot of that is still the result of how these communities were divided during British reign. And I think without accepting that, we can't really see how to untangle racial relationships. Having said that, you know, I don't think most people go about their lives, their everyday lives in Malaysia thinking, oh, it's so awful. I mean, I'm a former colonial subject. People are striving just to get on with their lives. They have work, they have jobs, they have education. So, you know, all these things, I think, come together in a very organic way. And what I try and do in my work is to show how the past hangs over us without being present in front of us all the time.
And in your book, Strangers on a Pier, you reflect on modern Asia through your own family story of migration. And in a chapter in which you describe your school class, you write the following, and I quote, "In just 1 year, we have divided and subdivided ourselves. And it is not race that created that schism. In just 1 generation, we created a society of hierarchy." What do you mean by that society of hierarchy?
I mean, we've created class. I mean that people always see distinctions amongst people, privileged, underprivileged, in terms of racial lines. They always see the divisions in a society according to who is white or who is black, and in Malaysia, who is Malay or who is Chinese or who is Indian. But very often what is missed in this is the intersection between race and class. And because I went to a Malaysian government school, so it was a very, very ordinary, a huge school, 2,000 boys. The teaching was very bad, but generally it was quite happy. You know, when we were small, we just mixed with each other in a very happy way. But as we were older, we could see that when it became time to apply to college, we could see suddenly how actually some parents, some boys, we thought we were just the same, but they knew certain things. They knew about music, they knew about art, they knew about books, literature. And we didn't know how they knew about this because we had the same, crappy education. And the reason they knew about it was because they had parents who knew about books and about art. And that's how this the beginnings of bourgeoisie happen in Malaysia. And when you layer this on top of a country that is becoming very rich very quickly, it means that a small number of people are then solidifying wealth in their own hands and pulling away from other people. So really, in Malaysia, like in Southeast Asia, what we have done in just two generations is to create a bourgeoisie that Western Europe took much longer to create. And I'll give you a very simple example. From this crappy school that I went to, the few people who ended up with middle-class jobs like lawyers or doctors, their children then went to Harvard, and they would never have been sent to a government school. They were all sent to private schools. Whereas in my generation, private schools didn't exist. Everyone went to the same lousy government school. So in just 20 years, we have created this sort of super elite. And that is not something to do with race. It's to do with money, and it's to do with class privilege.
Thank you. I want to invite Radna Fabias on stage. She was born and raised in Curaçao, debuted as a poet with the amazing poetry collection Habitus, which won all major poetry awards here in the Netherlands and Belgium. Habitus has been translated into English, French, Spanish, Arabic, and German. And Radna Fabias also translates poetry herself. Welcome. I actually want to invite you to read from Habitus.
I will.
It's a poet at the beginning of the book. Do you think we need to know something before you? It's the beginning.
Well, I'm going to read in Dutch, so
yeah. A handout.
I don't want to break this. It has happened before.
Oh.
Wat ik verstopte. Velgen. De onberispelijk opgepoetste in de zon glimmende velgen, te groot en te duur voor de auto's waaronder ze draaien. De geblindeerde ruiten van de auto's met de glimmende velgen, de ver naar achteren leunende bestuurders van de auto's met de geblindeerde ruiten en de glimmende velgen, de explosieve bassen uit de in de kofferbak geïnstalleerde subwoofers, het stof van de dorre velden en haarvet, groen. Of de zwarte versie ruikt naar olieraffinaderij, perfect voor het haar van de moderne neger in de jaren 80. Perfect om de natuurlijke zwartheid te onderstrepen, te laten glinsteren. Perfect om het stof te dragen van de dorre velden waarop doornige struiken groeien. Het stof. Het door de passaatwind meegevoerde stof overal op en tussen barretjes langs alle al dan niet geasfalteerde wegen, de vrouwen en de barretjes achter het traliewerk langs de wegen, de vrouwen, de gaten, de vrouwen op straat. Maar niet als het donker is. De gaten in de weg. De mannen die bij de bar langs de weg bier en soms een whisky cola drinken en uiteindelijk de auto vinden, uiteindelijk wegrijden, uiteindelijk het huis vinden, uiteindelijk thuiskomen, uiteindelijk de vrouw vinden die niet langs de weg bij de bar stond te drinken, uiteindelijk haar geslacht zoeken, aan haar geslacht herkennen waar ze zijn, welk huis het is, welke van de vele vrouwen met in leggings gehesen billen als bumpers, waarop je naar een nabijgelegen eiland kunt liften, zegt men. Vrouwen die hun kleren als een tweede huid dragen. Er bestaat niet zoiets als 2 maten te klein. Mannen met zwarte vingers onder een afdakje naast hun huis. Onder een motorkap gebogen, een zwetende bierfles in de hand. Dat afdakje heet een garage. En dat is een monteur. Als hij shock-a-shobbe zegt, bedoelt hij shock-absorbers. Schokdempers. Hoe snel ze daar slijten, want gaten in de wegen waarlangs mannen met tondeuses en scheermessen onder een boom. Zo'n man heet een barbier. Mannen die geld komen innen, zo'n man heet een Arabier. Mannen met wapens en whisky onder een boom, zo'n man heet een kaffer. Onweerstaanbaar voor vrouwen met kinderen op de arm. De geur van hun verbrande huid in de zon, de gouden tanden vrouwen, in wie haar de geur van chemische ontkroezer dagen later nog hangt. Daar bovenop de verbrande geur van hun gebakken haar, want het moet gladder en het hoeft ook geen haar te zijn. Plastic op het hoofd en de vingers van de vrouwen. Vrouwen met krulspelden, de huizen in snoepkleuren, de kerken, de in de kleur van rijpe bananen geschilderde kerken, de tamarindebomen, de leguanen, de hagedissen met de half geamputeerde staarten, de loslopende geiten, de kraaiende hanen, de aan bomen geketende honden, de overreden zwerfhonden. De onder olie lekkende auto's, slapende zwerfhonden, de kogels die klinken als vuurwerk. Het vuurwerk tegen boze geesten. De kogels tegen boze mensen, de kogels van boze mensen, de kranten vol bloed. De zware, ronkende motoren van de even zware jongens. De oude vrouwen langs de wegen. Ze verkopen staatsloten. Ze verkopen hoop langs de wegen, langs de gaten in de wegen en in het stof. De straatjongens op de kleine fietsen. Hoe ze op de fiets om net menstruerende meisjes dansen. De moeders die daarvoor waarschuwen. De moeders. Alleen het stof. Het gras in de tuin van mensen die wel een sproeier kunnen betalen, groene. De kleur van de mensen die wel een sproeier kunnen betalen, bleker. Dan de junk in de tuin van de mensen die wel een sproeier kunnen betalen. De spullen onder de arm van de junk in de tuin van de mensen die wel een sproeier kunnen betalen. De diep zwarte kleur van de straatjunk aan wiens voeten een dikke laag eelt is gegroeid. Dat zijn natuurlijke schoenzolen. De autovrakken, het zwerfvuil, de dorstige aarde, de apocalyptische regenbuien, de wind, de orkanen, de Spaanstalige soaps, de siliconen borsten van de vrouwen in de Spaanstalige soaps, het bloederige nieuws uit de nabijgelegen landen, de misverkiezingen, de siliconen borsten van Miss Venezuela, de moedertaal, de officiële taal, de officieuze taal, de officieus gesegregeerde supermarkten, de officieus gesegregeerde scholen, de onthoofde haan in de tuin van de overbuurvrouw, de tarotkaarten van de overbuurvrouw, de wierook van de overbuurvrouw, de wierook in de bananengele kerken, de kerken, de waarzegsters. De heksen die de gokker bedienen, het gokken. Misschien morgen winnen, misschien morgen wel winnen. De zwetende tegen elkaar schurende lichamen, dat heet dansen. De hitte, het washandje in de broekzak van de buschauffeur. De hete luchtblazende ventilatoren, de stoetrouwende mensen. De mensen die zich op de doodskist van een geliefde laten vallen en schreeuwen. Dat heet rouwen. De begraafplaatsen waar mensenresten op elkaar gestapeld liggen. De vrouwenstemmen die de rozenkrans bidden. De transistorradio. De vrouwenstemmen uit de transistorradio die de rozenkrans bidden. De weesgegroetjes. De onze vaders. De verheven stemmen van het volk uit de transistorradio. De DJ die over de liedjes uit de transistorradio praat. De verzoeknummers uit de transistorradio waar de DJ overheen praat. De abrupt vallende nacht. De terechte angst in de nacht. De geesten Het rimpelende asfalt, het gebrek aan vluchtwegen, het gebrek aan seizoenen. Het gebrek hoe alles door zee omringd is. Hoe alles onder de zon verschroeit. De verschrikking, de toeristen. Altijd lachen naar toeristen, dat heet opvoeding. De zon, het blauw. Het onmogelijke blauw van de lucht. Het onmogelijke blauw van de zee. De vissers in bootjes drijvend op de onmogelijk blauwe, transparante zee. Het zand. De aangespoelde vissenstaarten in het witte zand. Het witte zand bij het onmogelijk blauw van de zee. Het witte zand dat verdacht veel lijkt op het stof. Het stof.
Thank you, Radna. So, Tash, was there a specific thought or feeling that stays with you after hearing and reading, in your case, the poem?
Well, hearing and reading. I mean, I'm a little bit transfixed by, like, hypnotized by Radna's voice. It's incredibly evocative, and yeah, I mean the details you picked out, and you know, one doesn't know whether to feel uncomfortable or to be kind of just seduced by beauty. It's very kind of equivocal tone.
Because I also saw a similarity between this poem and also something in your book, The South. Because I think in both there's a kind of juxtaposition between nature and modernity or disruption by humans. Why do you think, Radna, that's if you agree, if something like that is such a good thing for literature, this nature versus modernity, or human man-made disruption?
I don't think I was actively trying to speak on that at all. I think one of the reasons I end up even speaking about nature, in this case about, I guess, island life, or the looks of the island and what people are surrounded by, is because there was no blank slate when I started writing this book. So I'm writing against a narrative that already exists, in which some of these things feature.
What is the existing narrative, you think?
Well, I think there's a very big tourism, and well, there are some romantic feelings I feel the Dutch have surrounding their former colonies, not just the islands. And the tourism thing is very big. It's also something that's being done there. And it's a part of a thing I was trying to discuss, because this is also one of the problems since, let's say, because we had several colonizers, but the Dutch kept them. And it's still one of the biggest economical problems, because a lot of people are dependent on a market that actually still uses them for cheap labor. And so I know this is a very big thing. I know when I first moved to the Netherlands, because I moved here when I was 17, people would ask me where I was from. And when I told them, they would be like, I don't understand why you would come here, because I would be happy to live there. And the romantic thoughts they had about the island, or just not the island. I think there's like one island. I think for a lot of people, when they speak about the Caribbean, there is one island, and it looks similar because that's what capitalism does to things. So the beach is nice, the weather is great, the people always smile, right? So that's what I was being given. And that's because that's such a powerful thing. And because it has existed for such a long time, whenever you want to discuss the place, or even speak about yourself as a product of a certain space, you're writing up against it. So I had no interest in writing about nature. I actually hate writing about nature. I don't feel I have that kind of pen.
No, because when I read Habitus, I really felt the place.
Well, I hope so. No, but I mean,
also the wind and the sea breeze
but those are there. This is the thing. I'm not particularly interested in adding to the narrative of that being some kind of paradise with all these beautiful natural features. But it was a part of my experience because I grew up there. And just as I'm writing about boys on small bikes in the hood, this is just a part of the entire experience. And I realized some of this actually is attached to the other narrative I was speaking of that preceded this. But it's just a detail. It's a detail. What I wanted to do is set up some of the themes that I wanted to speak about. And I wanted to make clear from the beginning that I was coming from a certain space, and I wanted it to be as close as possible to my experience. So I used the details around that. And some of it is, yes, nature, because the beaches are nice.
I mean, I found that the reason I found the descriptions, when you sent me the PDF of Radna's book, I found the descriptions of nature really, really fascinating, because the relationship between the poet and nature was very uncomfortable. It was very equivocal. It wasn't at all beautifying. It wasn't prettifying it. It was sometimes very beautiful, but other times just as the backdrop to people doing slightly horrible things, or living lives that were quite grubby in a way. People striving to sort of just have a normal life, other people not failing to have a great life. So actually, the landscape becomes imbued with these kind of ambitions or failed hopes, desire, all these kind of things, which means that the landscape isn't just one thing. And I think the problem with tourism or looking at a particular landscape from the outside is that it does reduce landscape to one thing, which is just it's pretty to look at. If you ask
to consume also,
and to consume, I think. When so in the book you referred to earlier, Strangers on the Pier, which is a memoir, which is basically set. It's a story of my family. I grew up half in the countryside and half in the city, and in Europe generally, if you live in the countryside, it's thought to be a place of ease and calm and peace and tranquility. In many parts of Asia, and I guess imagine in many other parts of the world, to live in the countryside is basically saying I live a deprived life. I live a life of lack of opportunity, lack of ease, lack of money. And the other thing you asked me earlier about what I learned about myself is that whenever I say to people in Europe that I spent my childhood in the countryside in Malaysia, basically in the jungle, people always say, "Oh, that must be so nice." And I can tell you, I hated every second of it. I couldn't wait for the time that I could go back to the city. Not just for the fact that there was TV or there was hot and cold water, but for the fact that I could feel attached to the world, that I wasn't trapped in a particular space that would define my future for the rest of my life, which is basically what happens if you're trapped in certain in rural areas. If you're close to nature in most of Malaysia, it basically means you're never going to leave it.
What's your take on that?
Many things. Well, there's no rural. There's not really a rural area because the island is really tiny, and this was one of the biggest islands. The other ones were even tinier, but there is a sense of people living in certain neighborhoods, and those are resource places, and other neighborhoods aren't. And this goes back all the way again to colonialism, when certain people were living in certain neighborhoods, and so they had access to things like education. I mean, proper education, because at one point there was actually how should I call them? The Dutch. They were working with the churches. So the colonial government was working with the Catholic Church. And this was for a long time, we didn't speak about this. These were all stories we heard now and then from older people who had lived through it. But they would like make a deal with the colonial government and take money away from those places where the formerly enslaved used to live and put the money in other educational places for other people. And this took a very long time, and everything was shaped around it. And so one of the things, because when you talk about being in a rural place and living in certain, surrounded by nature, for example, the west side of the island, even though you don't have like a proper, there's no jungle there, but it's a little more secluded. Those are where the beaches are, the southwest. Those are the beautiful beaches, and then you have like the unnatural beaches that were made for the tourists, and those are close to a resort, so they don't have to actually go on the island and look for things. But the really beautiful beaches, the beaches of my youth, were on that side. And people who lived there historically were the people who were enslaved. And after that, kept there, because after being enslaved, they had to keep working for their former masters for a very long time, so they would have a place to live. And then they would not get into the educational system, and the Catholic Church would try them. So people would be visited, and then if they thought you were not a good Christian, or if you seemed too vocal, or in any way kind of dangerous, you will not get in. So there's a big population of people growing up around there who are not literate because they didn't get into the educational system. There is also a great group of people who got inferior education. And when you were talking earlier about how a middle class emerges, in the case of the island, this is how a middle class emerges. And the middle class does not consist of only non-white people. So the middle class is also the people who were great Christians and who did get into some kind of school and are now sometimes protecting the system. So that's what I was thinking. That's a bit of what I was thinking when you were speaking about rural versus city.
Yeah.
To be clear, we don't have a city. Like everything is just around the corner from each other.
I also want to ask you to read part of The South, Het Zuiden in Dutch. Yeah, it's a book that came out this year. And it tells the story of a Malaysian family who travels south to a piece of land the family inherited, a once flourishing farm that has fallen into disrepair. And the book explores all sorts of themes like generational shifts and class and the tension between individualism and collectivism. And at its heart, there's also a love story between two boys, Jay and Chuan. And the part you're going to read is about Sui, the mother of the main character, Jay. Do you think people need something more to know? Okay.
So I'm going to read just a very short passage describing the experience of Sui, who is the mother of this family who's moved to the south of Malaysia it's during 1 month at the end of the year. And this family has moved from the capital to this farm, which is dying. It's in the very rural part of the country. And suddenly, because they are freed from all their daily obligations like work, housework, homework, they're able to think about themselves and their pasts and their lives. And she has married a man who is older than her, much more educated than her. She comes from a very poor background. When she was a teenager, her parents praised the drawings and watercolors she produced during the single hour of art lessons at school each week. And in her adolescent fantasies, she thought that maybe she could become a painter, even though she had no idea how artists lived or made a living. It just seemed like the opposite of the life she had known up until then, dictated by early starts and rigid routine helping her parents at work, and that was enough to make it appealing for her. But even as she daydreamed, she knew that she would have to get a proper job with a salary. She was smart, she could read fluently and work out numbers quickly, and soon she was managing her parents' income, paltry though it was, setting aside enough money to buy fertilizer and new tools whenever she could. It's called budgeting, she explained to her parents, barely able to control her exasperation. Why couldn't they grasp something so simple? It wasn't only money that was beyond them. They couldn't understand English, could just about get by in Malay. They couldn't write fluently in Chinese. She was 16 and already responsible for taking them to the bank to set up an account, to the police station and local registry when one of them lost their ID card or driving license, to the immigration department for passports. Every visit to a government office prompted her to have the same questions. Why did all the officials in all these places always call her Amoy? Did they really think that all Chinese girls had the same name? And if so, how did they decide on Amoy? Why not Amei, Aching, Aling? Who decided on a racist nickname? Why couldn't her parents lose their accent and speak properly so that the people in power couldn't make fun of them, repeating what they just said in an even more exaggerated manner? Why did her parents have to speak to her in Cantonese? Their country accents obvious to anyone, even if they couldn't understand the dialect. Sometimes she felt like laughing along with the officials to show that she was on their side. She didn't know if those people, sitting behind plexiglass screens, wearing uniforms and name badges, she didn't know if they looked down on her and her family because they were Chinese or because they were poor. She wanted to be one of those people who did the despising, not those who were despised. Who was the despiser, who the despised, within her own family? One day, her father came into her room, poised at the door, while she was lying on her bed reading a magazine and listening to a Tai Chi cassette that she had bought with the money she'd earned from her after-school work. Her father had come to pester her about doing more hours on the farm, but she ignored him. When she finally looked up, she saw the hatred on his face, the hatred for what he saw as her laziness, which filled him with revulsion. It was, to him, despicable. He turned off the player, took the tape out and tried to break it, but he couldn't. He was too weak. His hands, which were supposed to have been strong after years of working the soil, had been rendered fragile by that labor, and he ended up flinging it on the floor. A sign of authority that they both knew in that moment was a sign of helplessness. She knew he had to go back to farming his little patch of earth, and she couldn't stop herself from loathing him for having to do that kind of work.
Thank you. So, what's something that resonates with you, Radna, when hearing this? What is it about for you?
What is it about? Well, I feel like it's a start of like a class conflict that emerges when one has access to resources that their parents didn't have access to. And it's pretty harsh. So I feel like some of it resonates with my experience, but also I think there's a part of me maybe I wouldn't allow myself even when I was younger to be angry in that way, because I was, I guess, too aware of the burden on the people I was angry with. So, but I think it's the emergence of that, like a sort of class consciousness.
I mean, I was really aware of the burdens of, you know, my parents and my grandparents too, but I just couldn't stop myself from being frustrated. You know, I couldn't stop myself.
And also embarrassed, right? Because that's
totally
also,
embarrassed.
Yeah.
And you know, people are ashamed to say that they're embarrassed of their parents, but I mean, who hasn't been? And people always say, oh, well, you know, everyone's embarrassed with their parents at school, but it's not the same thing, because you know, in families like mine, which are very, very typical of a lot of families in Southeast Asia, you know, growing up in this period of great change, what you have is a lot of social mobility happening very quickly. And so the children have access to education for the first time in the whole history of this family. And so they're really the first ones who are able to see, okay, maybe if I pass these exams, then maybe I can go to college, whereas the parents didn't have that. And the parents want this for you. They want you to have what they didn't have.
Yeah, and you see what the cost of that is, because
Exactly.
it doesn't come naturally, and a lot of work has to be moved around for you to be able to do that. And also, I feel like if my anger was mostly around the responsibility that came with, because failure was not an option. Of course, not just for me, but for a lot of migrant children, I feel, and also for a lot of people. And when I say migrant, I'm not only speaking about moving countries. I'm also speaking about class migration. I feel the burden of that, especially when you're younger, can be a lot, because this is not the context where, you know, your parents kind of know what things look like. You are sent into a place they don't know. And then there's the burden that you're not allowed to feel there, because people are working way too hard for this to be possible. And I think the anger I felt when I was younger was more around that. And instead of being embarrassed, I was extremely protective, for at least towards one parent.
But I think, yes, I mean,
you felt the anger, but you did not allow yourself to feel it?
I did allow, oh God, I did. Yeah, you should speak to my mom. Yes, but not the kind of anger that the voice in your book just was indulging in or kind of like struggling with. It was mostly the burden of, there is something about seeing people work really hard, and it's like a joint venture, because it's not just one person, because one person wouldn't be able to do it. So there's like an entire community of people going, go! You know, like, we are doing all the things so you can go, and now you have to go and do the thing. And that burden on a young person is a lot, and it made me extremely angry. It made me anxious. It made me, I think, very alert, and maybe also prepared me for, I don't know if you also have this problem, like this kind of like overcompensating.
Yeah, completely.
Because like, I remember when I went, because I went to a good school, right? There was like in our neighborhood, where I grew up with my grandparents. There was a school, but they called it like the tienerzwangerschapsschool. Like if you went there, you would probably get pregnant. And then my mom didn't want that for me, but I was like, it wasn't possible because we had to move first. We had to move to a different neighborhood because the school would actually ask people to live there, and they had to prove that. Otherwise, they couldn't actually go to that school. So my mom moved us. And of course, we couldn't afford that. So we were living in like former maid's house, like behind the villas. But we were in the neighborhood, so I could get in. And I don't know where I'm going with the story. How did it start?
It was interesting.
It's about anger.
Yes.
About
and I
manifesting. How the
remember,
anger manifested.
I have it now. I went there, and I remember on the first day, when I was supposed to go to school, they told my mom, like, oh no, a mistake has been made. She will not be able to attend the school. And my mom got really angry. And she was like, oh, yes, she will, because like the papers haven't, and I can't fix another thing. And then she was like, okay, so I'm bringing her, and you make sure she can attend class. And also she bluffed, like she knew people. She really didn't. And then the head of the school said, well, okay, but she better perform. And it never leaves you. It never leaves you because you realize that your presence in certain spaces is always conditional. So it shapes you in every way. So I get, I feel that...
my anger was primarily, I can see now, I think even at the time, I was angry at the system that made it so that my parents put so much pressure on me and, not my parents, but the whole community. I was angry against a system that made it so that if you came from a certain kind of background, failure was not an option. You couldn't fail. Whereas like now I live in a world where, everyone fails all the time and it's fine. It's totally fine.
It's jarring, right?
It's really, my sisters who grew up like me, their children, they always say, oh, why don't you just try? And if you don't, it's fine, which is completely,
it's about trying.
It's about trying. It's not about, it's completely really so alien to me. And I think I was angry against the system because I could see how much sacrifice was involved from the parents and for the children. But because I couldn't express that anger against the system, when you're 12, 13, 14, you don't know what the system is. And so the only people against whom I could voice this anger were the parents, the people who were putting this pressure on me. And I think what made me sad was as I grew older, 12, 13, 14, 15, and this is the time when you think, okay, well, by that time also other things come to intersect into the equation. In my case, sexuality was one of these things. I thought, because I know I'm queer, I need to get the hell out of this space. And, I didn't love studying. I wasn't naturally gifted but I thought, all these things meant that I need to get out of this place. And so I need to do what my parents wanted me to do. But the more I achieved what they wanted for me, which is to acquire learning, acquire language, acquire vocabulary, acquire books, art, music, the greater the distance grew between me and them. So it was like we were both conspiring to put distance between us. Alice Walker describes this phenomenon in her essay, which is called My Father's Country is the Poor, where she describes, she was very close to her father, and he was this very brilliant man, but illiterate. And after she went to college for just one semester, she came back, she just found she couldn't communicate with him anymore. And I found this also with my cousins. This is why the book is the way it is, divided into two as a family, because I grew up half in the city and half in the countryside. With my cousins, with whom I was very close when I was 8, 9, 10. We shared the same language. We could see, communication was very easy. And the more I read books, the more I acquired learning, the more my sentences began to change, my language began to change, my cultural references began to change, and I became a foreigner to them. And so this is why I think in this book, as in a lot of my work, you have a lot of what it means to have divisions between the family. You might feel close still, sentimentally, but actually it becomes very hard to be.
Maybe it's good to read the other part about Jay and Chuan and their discussion. Because it's also about that division.
So Jay and Chuan are two boys. They're teenagers. They're late teenagers. One is slightly older than the other, and he's been born on this farm which is failing. He's never had money. He's not educated. He's already a man, and he lives quite a harsh life. Jay has come down with his mother Sui earlier, and who you heard about earlier, and he is now helping Chuan out in the farm, and the farm has migrant workers from Indonesia, and one morning, this is Jay narrating, one morning Chuan and I arrived at the hangar to find it empty, and soon it became clear that the men were not going to come. At that time of day, the place was usually bright and noisy with the metallic clang of tools, but today it felt like a museum, the tools undisturbed. Maybe they were anticipating the period of inactivity that would follow. Maybe even inanimate objects could sense that Budi and Eka and the other migrant workers would never return. But it's always like that, Chuan said, shrugging. They just disappear without warning. But there had been warning, I wanted to say. There had been plenty of time to see that things were not going well, and that the farm manager should have been making more of an effort to find different kinds of work for the men, something more profitable, less harsh. Couldn't you help them out somehow, I asked. Chuan shook his head. You don't understand how things are out here, he said sharply. People come, people go. It's not a drama. For you, maybe, not for us. But what's happened to them? Aren't you worried? Chuan looked at me as if he couldn't comprehend what I'd asked, and just as I was about to repeat myself, he held up both hands, palms facing upwards, appealing to the heavens. You gone crazy or what? What kind of universe do you live in? Let me ask you this. If every day you go to the market and there's a guy sweeping the drains and one day he's not there, do you worry about him? I nodded. I would wonder, yes. I would wonder what he was doing, why he had to leave. I can tell you, Chuan said, I can tell you he wouldn't be worried about you. He turned in his head and spat on the ground. I had never seen him do that before, and I could tell it was intended to repulse me, to show me how different we were. He wouldn't give a fuck about you or your life, he said. That's not the point, I replied. The point is human empathy. He threw back his head and laughed, again artificially, I thought. The sound that came out of his throat was hard and plasticky, as though he was imitating someone else. Human empathy, he replied in a high-pitched feminine voice. You know, I chat to the people who come in every day to the 7-Eleven where I work. I know their lives, they know mine. But what really do I know about them, and what do they know about me? We exchange pleasantries, hello, how are you, how's your son, is your father okay, and all that bullshit. The next day I get sacked. Do you think they worry about me, or whether I'm getting paid on time? People don't give a fuck about other people, not in my universe at least. You guys have so much time on your hands, you can worry about that. What did you call it? Human what? Human empathy, I replied.
Thank you. And about communication, you wrote Strangers on a Pier, where we already talked about. Also for your parents, so they could read it, you wrote a maybe shorter book.
Yeah.
And it is also about the story of your parents and your family story. And you also once said, or twice, or maybe multiple times, that it is a story about silence.
Yeah, and it's something that Radna also talks about around her work, which is that my parents traditionally have not read my novels. And it's not that they can't read English, but I think to read a 300-page novel, something even if you can read the language, you need to have stamina. You need to have practice at reading literature, and they don't have that. And I think also they're slightly afraid of what they might find about how they're going to be portrayed. Whether they're going to be portrayed in a slightly uncomfortable way, in a slightly negative way. And so I felt I needed to write something small for them, like really short, very, very concentrated. So I wrote a book called Strangers on the Pier, which is about them. And it was about stories that I knew that they had, that they were withholding from me. So part of this process of social mobility is that because the parents want you to become middle class, the pressure they put on you is so that you can become someone totally different from them, with an education, with a middle class outlook. And for that to happen, they can't, in my parents' case at least, they feel they cannot give you their stories because this will kind of somehow infect you with the mentality of poor people. So I really grew up knowing very little about my parents. And I'd written a couple of novels, 3 novels then, and then I had a career as a writer. So I said to my parents, I really want to capture your story. I did this thing, that stupid thing of writers saying, I want to capture my parents' stories. So I sat down with them, and I don't want these stories to be lost. And it went very, very badly. and
I could have told you that.
Yes, I didn't. And they agreed to talking to me. They said, okay, fine, we'll talk. So I made appointments with my parents, both of them, my father especially. I knew had a very, very tough upbringing. And the moment I placed the iPhone recorder on the table, he just went silent. And so the book is about, my American editor was hoping for this huge, expansive memoir where everyone exchanges how they feel about each other, and then they get to the end, and then they hug, and then they cry, and everyone understands each other. And then finally, they got this tiny book about silence. And what was interesting in that was that a couple of things. I got a couple of things out of them, and I've heard whispers of stories over the years, and one of them was that my father didn't have a pair of shoes until he was the age of 10. And so I mentioned this in the book, and one of his comments later was, well, why did you go and tell everyone that I didn't have shoes until I was 10? Which is a bit like, what you've said, your family members saying, well, why did you say we're, bigoted, homophobic? Because it's true, and it's part of what makes life real. And I wasn't going to make a filtered version, a censored version, of their story. And slightly more very quickly, slightly more poignantly, I told my mother that I had written this small book, and it involved her parents, so she really should read about this because it's been published in magazines. And so she read it, and I rang her and said, so did you like it? And she said, yeah, it was good. And but you got one detail wrong, which is a very crucial detail apparently, because I say in the
Was it already published?
An extract was published in the New Yorker, in fact. So I told her it's published in the New Yorker as an American man. She didn't know what it was, obviously. And she said, you got it wrong, because when you say your grandfather came to the village as a young man on his own, it is not true. He did not come on his own. He came with someone else. And she knew this because one day when she was a child, they got a phone call from the local psychiatric hospital in the nearest big town to say there's this man who's been found homeless on the street, and he doesn't know anyone. He's completely, he's completely disconnected from reality. The only thing he has is your grandfather's name and phone number. And my grandfather said, this was the boy who came with me on this boat from China when we were both 15. And so I have to have him come to this house. He's my only link with my childhood. My grandmother said, no, don't bring this mad person into the house. He's going to bring evil. But my grandfather insisted, and this poor man sat in the corner of this room. This is my mother telling me this story, like very matter of fact. And she said, yeah, he sat in the corner of the room for 3 days. And then on the 4th day, we found him dead in the river. And I said, well, why did you never tell me this before? And she said, oh, it's very boring. And there was just a silence on the phone. And I didn't know what to say. And then she said, oh, so what did you have for dinner tonight? And it was just this terrible thing of, I felt myself, like we were saying earlier, I felt like that was a territory that she didn't intend for me to trespass on. That was not my business. And suddenly I was also colluding in this erasure of these lives. So this poor man, in the time that my grandfather had managed to make some kind of a life for himself in this new country, he totally failed. He was alone, he died on the street, basically. And I thought, where is a space in writing for people like him? Where is a space in the history of my people for men like him? And I thought somehow he should be preserved. But telling this awkward story was the only way I could do it. I didn't feel right for me to reinvent his life. So he exists only in the fragment.
Radna, do you? Yeah.
How did you write it? Is it matter of fact, like your mom told you?
I write it just like my mother told me.
I'm happy to hear that.
I write.
Oh, because I feel it's important, and I feel like the delivery is also part of a writer's problem when speaking or when writing about these people that you're not, but who have shaped you. So I was curious what choice you made, because I would obviously love to read your mom's voice. But that's just like a side note.
Well, I think what I describe is not just the story. In the telling of her telling the story to me, what you also get is the awkwardness between me and her.
Yeah, but that's an important awkwardness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think so basically the story, the whole book, I think, is filled with this kind of awkwardness. It's filled with the gaps between us.
Yeah, I feel like that. No, but you have a question.
So the question is, if you also think that there's a function to that silence.
Well, I guess when it started to bother me, because I
silence?
Because I felt like it was the information being withheld. Part of that was actually preventing me from understanding certain things. But that was my problem, right? So when I started to write, and again, I also did what you did, and I had this one family member I went to speak to, and I set up my camera. I usually have like a camera or just a recorder. It turned out, I think about after 3 or 4 conversations, I would bring the recorder when I was talking to women. And when I was talking to men, I would set up the video because they would go silent. And then at least I would have their body language or their pacing or their nervously looking away or, like shameful gestures, loads of shameful gestures. But what happens is when you want to speak about this because it's something that bothers you and it also prevents you from understanding certain things, that doesn't mean that it's not also a part of a problem I'm having while I'm writing, because it's also a thing that I experience as I'm sitting there, because I've been taught to feel the burden of the community that shaped me, because it's not a very individual culture. Yeah, this thing, we do things together. I think it's a very natural thing for people who are actually born and raised around, poverty or other situations where you just can't go like, no, I'll do the things my way because I will survive on my own, because you won't. So there was this culture where people do things together, and then you feel the burden of all the people surrounding you, and then you want to talk about certain things, and then some of them just go silent or become defensive or will not. Also, there's cultural things like speaking to elderly people in a certain way or asking certain questions. And then, so after having several failed conversations, which didn't really, I mean, those were not failures, because they were teaching me how to approach this. You get to the point where you have to inspect the silence itself and then look for the purpose of it, because obviously approaching it from my end is just a problem, because I want to understand things and you guys are not sharing, and then you're ashamed. Please don't be ashamed. Or there's the risk of you shaming me because now I want to say things. And then I'm all in my head, right? But this thing, this silence has, it is surrounded by culture and it is shaped by history. And it has consequences for the people living there, because when I started doing this, I just left the island. By the time I wrote the book, I'd been living in the Netherlands as long as I'd lived there. And I would go back and forth every other year to visit my mother, and then I would take my recording gear and do the thing. And then I started to speaking to people here as well. And then I realized, like, okay, so this thing has a purpose, right? So what is it covering? What is it protecting? Who is it protecting? And what are the risks with certain things, like emotional risks for individuals, but also like their livelihoods. Sure. Sometimes, you know, if they speak about one thing, then the trauma comes out and they've been sitting on these things for like ages. So then when you inspect that, then you realize that it's not, first of all, you really don't matter.
Yeah, but also, but also, you know, livelihood, but also political. In a tightly knit society, you know, there's always some kind of political reverberation. What I think I've learned to appreciate is that what we share is precisely the silence, because I always used to think that the silence is what stood between us.
No, you're doing it too.
But exactly,
it's inside you. I guarantee you.
And this is something I've learned to kind of appreciate, the fact that actually this is what bonds us. And I think as writers, you know, when you think of what it means to be a writer, you're automatically drawn towards a certain model, which is that of, it's basically a Western novel informed by a 19th century novel, and boosted, accelerated by the American model of storytelling, which is to reveal everything, to understand everything. And actually,
even the wish to understand things and then having to go through the silence to do that is shaped by this.
Yeah, but I think the only result I feel kind of quite happy now is that I'm very comfortable with the silence and owning the silence as something shared. And owning, you know, the separation. So, you know, this thing, that the divide, the distance between us, that is caused by social mobility, education, all the rest of it. That is something actually to be learned. I mean, the other thing is, we're so predicated to believe that we can only love and appreciate someone by being close to them, by being physically close to them. So, you know, when I saw my parents, you know, left us for many, you know, long periods of time because they had to go somewhere else to work. And I now see this as an expression of pure love, because they were doing it because they loved us. Whereas nowadays, you know, in France or even Britain or most Western countries, to show love to someone, you have to be with them all the time. You know, I can't bear to be without you. You know, I have to be with you all the time. And yet, there is a kind of a beauty, and there is a kind of love in separation and in silence, I think.
Do you really feel you no longer understand each other?
I think we understand each other instinctively, but there are certain things that you can't... You know, when I spoke to my parents a few days ago, and they said, "What are you doing like this week?" And I said, "I'm going to give a talk in Amsterdam." And they don't know what this means.
Have they never been to one of your talks?
No. They can't imagine what why I would go to Amsterdam to do a talk.
That's a great question.
I mean, it's a very existentialist question, I know, but
no, I mean they have a point.
They can't visualize this, and they can't visualize what the job of a writer might be, and so sometimes I would like them to have a closer understanding, but I mean they can't.
You want them to have a different understanding.
I really would love a few things to happen that you're later on are going to read one more piece. But first I'm going to take a look at the audience if there are also any questions from the audience.
Hi. Thank you so much for very... Ooh. My Yeah, thank you so much for this conversation. There's a lot going on in my mind right now, but I wanted to make the question very specific. So when you talked about culture and language, how it emerges by being there, being with your family, growing up there, and that's how you learn a language, for example, learn a culture. And then you also talked about this anger and this distance that through this education and through striving to get something more separates you from this culture. And I think in Strangers on the Pier, I could not find the sentence right now, but you spoke something about forgetting for an immigrant when you move out and because of this anger, because of this distance that you have sort of in your time understood, my question, I guess, is just about how do you try to preserve that within you when you have this anger? Or do you just find a sweet spot where you kind of are in a comfortable silence? Because the most authentic way is to engage with that culture, but when you are angry at that culture sometimes, and I can go on, but I guess that's my question. But
thank you.
Radna, do you want to? I mean, I think it's a very difficult and very complex question to answer, and I think everyone has their own way of dealing with it. But I think that culture isn't something that's static, and your relationship with culture isn't static. You might be angry during one phase of your life at what you've inherited or what's been given to you, and you might, in a very valid way, say you want to distance yourself from it. You might want to distance yourself from the things of your upbringing. I think that's a completely valid thing to experience. But you might also later on think, actually, I want to be closer to that. I want to have a more daily experience of it. And, it could be with language. It could be with the languages of your childhood. I have a very complicated relationship with the languages of my childhood because they mean something to me politically. And anyone who knows anything about the politics and the history of Malaysia knows that language represents something. So the language you speak represents how you are seen by others. So, do you speak the language of the dominant class? Do you speak the language of not the dominant class? What are you trying to do with your language? So all these things, I guess what I'm trying to say is that I don't think one should search for one specific answer to it. I think one's relationship with one's own culture, specifically the culture that you've been born into and grown up with, is something that is in flux. It is something that is evolving all the time. And the more you can appreciate these evolutions, the fact that it is not going to be the same, and sometimes, you just want to forget all about it, that is also valid. And I don't think you should feel bad about it if that's what you want to do.
I also acknowledge the mess. I mean, you can hate the thing that you also really love. Like I love my people. I also don't feel like, I feel like parts of the culture that shaped me, harmed me, but also there are parts of that same culture that made me who I am and actually built me. So I embrace those. It's just, and I hate the ones I hate. You don't have to like the entire package. You can, you know.
Thanks. Here's also a question.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to connect three things, so sorry if it's convoluted. You've spoken about how this distance that emerges can be a sort of collective project, your parents wanting your life to be different, being one thing. Then perhaps the queer identities also get a sort of projection, rejection kind of double team there. And it resonated with me later on with the question of anger and not being able to direct that anger in the right direction as a child. And I was wondering, because kind of starting to understand how to direct that anger in the system of oppression that causes your parents to act towards you the way they do, this understanding itself is a product of the social mobility that is caused. Yeah, and absolutely. Then one of the problems, I'm just asking this for myself, I guess, is that I cannot communicate my forgiveness to my parents with the language they don't have, because they've, you know, you get this sort of double problem. So how do you, I guess my question is, where does the anger go now?
Thanks.
Radna, where has your anger gone?
Oh, it's there all the time. It's a different kind of anger, because it's what he's describing. Well, I didn't have to go through that process. I also feel like I still share language with my mother, specifically. And with many family members. Like you were describing how it was becoming impossible to communicate, but I feel like it's a language, it's a different language. And not like literal different language, like it could be in Dutch, but I speak a different language there. They know how to read me in a way that people around here don't know how to read me, parts of me at least. So I'm like, and my anger is also like that. It is kept in different spaces. I have taught myself that not everyone needs to hear my forgiveness if there was something there that was hurtful. But in the case of a very important thing like this, I would still know the language to do that in, but it would be very uncomfortable. Very, very, like, extremely painful. And
why?
Because there's all this information, right? You're sent out into the world, and then you share similar experiences and stories, and things have been done for you in order to get certain knowledge, and blah, blah, blah. And then you come back with all this information. So if you give a read, it can be just destruction. And it also hurts because you don't want to. I think the interview they sent you, I was saying, like, why would I slap someone in the face with this if this is not a part of their frame of reference? Is there another way for me to do this? It's a very difficult thing. I think maybe you should hop on this question, because I could go on for hours. I'm just angry. It randomly emerges, and I try to direct it to the people and the systems who deserve it.
Yeah, exactly. I think I think what, as one grows older, I think what I've tried to do is to use the learning, to use the education, to clarify that anger. Because I think a lot of the time anger isn't, the reason one has anger is because one doesn't have any other means of articulating a feeling. And so it comes out in this kind of blind anger. But the more you break down what you're feeling, the more you realize actually, you know, you're resentful against a system. You're resentful against a system that has produced this dynamic between you and your parents. And so actually a lot of the anger that I might once have had against my parents or my grandparents, I think that has dissipated. Now, the most relevant, I think for me, the most poignant of your questions is how you then use that language, what language you use to communicate it with them. And I think, like Radna, I think one always one always finds a way. One never loses the language and the culture of your youth. You never lose that spontaneity, no matter how hard you try to get away from that. There is always some kind of way of doing this. But also, I think not to underestimate the fact that the language you learn is also comprehensible to them, and that it can be used to communicate things that they already know.
Also translate. I found that there are ways to translate the new experiences, the new knowledge you get to this other language I just stated. I still speak with these people. I had this one student once. She talked to me about something like this. And there was this problem around religion. And she couldn't take her parents using religious language around her, because that was a very hurtful thing. The hurtful things happened around that. And then, I'm also angry at church. And we had this conversation, and I told her, after, there was this one family member who could only communicate with me after being born again by talking about Jesus. And doing that, I realized, because of the importance
I think we all have that family member. I think we all have that family member.
Well, sadly, a lot of us do, yeah. But also, this is the thing where what I mean when I say translating. What is she saying? What is the importance of this saying? She's calling it Jesus to her. And why would she want me to have it? Because it's doing something nice for her. And she wants that nice thing for me, even though I reject the church she's in and the things they're doing to people, right? So I told her, this is my trick. When this person speaks to me, when she tells me, God bless you, I hear, I love you. Because that's her language.
Yeah.
This is what she's saying. I want you to talk to Jesus.
Yeah.
Because Jesus did this one thing for me. And there's this is a very, I'm making it smaller than it is, and it sounds a little funny, but it's the idea of realizing that the languages that people speak contain so much information about their wishes.
Yeah.
And also them communicating in that same language towards you.
Yeah.
Also communicates their wishes for you.
I really would love to end this with another poem, if you might. And then we're going to let it linger, that poem there, and maybe talk to each other outside.
Feels like therapy. It's great that it's being recorded. It doesn't feel intrusive at all. Thank you. Roesplaat. Onderweg naar de roesplaats bewater en bemest ik 1 vierkante kilometer rood-bruine aarde. Het is een altruïstische investering. Ik maak het mogelijk voor een ander om wortel te schieten, uit te dijen en het ecosysteem te verstoren. Dan was ik mijn handen lang en grondig. Ik trek de afdrukken van mijn vingers. Voorzichtig. Ik ben voorzichtig. Ik knip mijn haar omdat ik een slachtoffer ben. Ik verf mijn haar omdat ik een schurk ben. Ik kweek een snor voor bij mijn valse papieren. Ik ben rustig. Ik ben rustig. De Boeing vlieg ik door de turbulentie en retrospectief naar de man die mij terloops en onbedoeld verwekte. Ik neem een gijzelaar, introduceer hem bij aankomst, zeg: deze man doet me aan jou denken, ik wil hem niet, we moeten praten, het is tragisch dat ik hem zal dragen. En ik zal hem dragen.
als een berenvel. Ik zal hem dragen als een mantel. Zijn huid ruikt naar woestijnhitte, fenugreek en open wonden. Mijn moeder breng ik terug naar het barre land, omdat ik van haar houd. Vanwege mijn moeder geef ik iedereen die op mij lijkt terug aan de aarde. Ik werp mijn mantel af, omdat ik van mijn moeder houd. Omdat ik van mijn moeder houd, bezweer ik de herhaling vanuit mijn afgeklemde eierstokken. Mijn afgeklemde eierstokken zijn schoon. Mijn afgeklemde eierstokken zijn schitterend. Mijn afgeklemde eierstokken zijn vervaardigd van reactieve metalen. Dan rust ik. Hier roest ik. Hier stopt het.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for this conversation. Tash Aw, Radna Fabias. Another applause.